This paper explores the material, affective, spiritual, and ethical dimensions of Sago-human convivialities amongst Indigenous Marind in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua. In the first part of the paper, I'll describe how species, stories, and the senses shape the ways in which Marind sense and make sense of sago as a cherished forest food. In the second part of the paper, I examine how intensifying processes of deforestation, monocrop oil palm expansion, and food commodification are giving rise to new and different kinds of hunger among Marind. These hungers, I argue, speak to an eco-social and cosmological breakdown in conviviality between Marind and their natural environments, a breakdown that manifests in part through reconfigured and subverted forms of commensality, or eating together, both among Marind themselves and among Marind's diverse, other than human, companion species. We travel now to the villages of Rayam, Bayau, and Mirav that lie along the upper reaches of the Bian River in the West Papuan district of Merauke. These villages, where I undertook 20 months of fieldwork between 2011 and 2019, are home to around 300 households who self-identify as Marindeg, or Marind of the forest. Marind derive their subsistence primarily from hunting, fishing, and gathering. Sago flour, the staple starch food, is supplemented with forest tubers and roots alongside fish and forest game such as deer, possums, cassowaries, kangaroos, crocodiles, and wild pigs. Fruit, including mangoes, rambutans, and coconuts, are also obtained from the forest alongside leaves, roots, barks, and resins that are used to make herbal concoctions and other medicines. As I learned from my Marind companions, forest foods like sago are always more than just food. This is because they derive from plants and animals with whom Marind entertain intimate and ancestral relations of kinship through shared descent from spirits, or dema. These species, in other words, are species whom Marind both eat, become with, and live with. The relations of Marind to their other-than-human siblings are anchored in principles of reciprocal exchange and care. Plants and animals grow to support their human kin by providing them with food and other resources. In return, humans offer respect and perform rituals as they encounter, hunt, gather, and consume kindred plants and animals in the forest. Marind's own bodies, too, are part of the multi-species food chain of the forest. When people die, their flesh decays to feed organisms in the sacred groves where they are buried, nourishing all manner of fungal and microbial communities. Exchanges of flesh and fluids across species lines thus commemorate and sustain the relations of humans to non-human life forms and are what endow forest foods with their nourishing qualities. Marind say that for a child to be nourished by the forest and by forest foods like sago, they must be born in the forest so they can touch the skin or surface of its environment and absorb the life-giving wetness of its soils, streams, and species in the form of water, mud, sap, pith, blood, and grease. Exchanges of skin and wetness between infants and the environment are encouraged even before birth, such as when mothers press their pregnant wombs against the trunks of sago palms, or when parents eat the flesh of organisms with whom children will later learn to share the forest, and whose flesh they too will consume. For instance, pigs, cassowaries, sago grubs, and more. But to become fully human, or anim in Marind terms, children must then continue to spend extended periods of time in the forest after they are born, where they will learn to share, interact with, and sustain the living environment. Such knowledge is best acquired through direct encounters with organisms in the forest, and more specifically, in sago groves. In the sago grove, Marind encounter a high density and diversity of their plant and animal kin, who make their homes in the sago palm, canopy, and undergrowth. Wild pigs, for instance, are attracted by the pith of felled palms and the cool waters of the sago swamp. Agile tree kangaroos and sugar gliders leap across the canopy, whilst solitary spotted possums nest between tightly bunched sago fronds. Various avian species, including inquisitive red-billed brush turkeys, emeraldine buff-faced pygmy parrots, and swooping white-breasted wood swallows, are also drawn to the grove, where they drink and feed, and to the safety of the sago tree crown where they roost and mate. Sago's companion plants are equally plentiful and include bishopwood, burtree, and nipa palms. Meanwhile, in the humid undergrowth, juicy ferns in circinate vernation surround the feet of sago trunks, whilst plump paddy straw mushrooms flourish along mature boles and in piles of rotting sago pith. For Marind, spending time in the grove is essential to learning how to respect, understand, and sustain the forest as a convivial feeding environment. Here, Marind learn to recognize juvenile mammals and birds, as well as gestating critters that should not be disturbed or hunted. Crouched on the moist soil and riverbanks, children are taught by their elders to identify the plants and animals that can be consumed and those that must be avoided, often based on the glossiness of their fur, feathers, tendrils, and bark. Children learn to carefully touch the skin or surface of the soil, vegetation, and rivers upon which human and multi-species pasts and relations are inscribed. They come to distinguish edible from inedible mushrooms from the texture and patterns of their plump surfaces. They are also encouraged to touch the lustrous hide and bloody flesh of animals to ascertain their health and consequent edibility. For Marind, spending time in the grove is essential to learning how to respect, understand, and sustain the forest as a convivial feeding environment. Here, Marind learn to recognize juvenile mammals and birds, as well as gestating critters that should not be disturbed or hunted. Crouched on the moist soil and riverbanks, children are taught by their elders to identify the plants and animals that can be consumed and those that must be avoided, often based on the glossiness of their fur, feathers, tendrils, and bark. Children learn to carefully touch the skin or surface of the soil, vegetation, and rivers upon which human and multi-species pasts and relations are inscribed. They come to distinguish edible from inedible mushrooms from the texture and patterns of their plump surfaces. They are also encouraged to touch the lustrous hide and bloody flesh of animals to ascertain their health and consequent edibility. As they grow up, children learn to make, cook, and consume sago flour, the staple starch of Marind and the food that many consider most nourishing. When they partake in these food procurement activities in the grove, children are also told stories of the ancestral spirits who created Marind and sago from a primordial mud at the beginning of time. They discover the names of different palm individuals and clusters, and the shared events, encounters, and interactions that these palms entertain with different Marind clans. Children will also hear songs about sago palms whose nourishing starch enabled Marind warriors in the past to conquer other tribes and territories as they traveled far and wide across the landscape. Marind children themselves learn how to support sago's growth by enhancing its environment through canopy thinning, base weeding, controlled burning, and sucker transplanting. These and other activities in the grove support the growth of humans by teaching them to interact, attune, observe, and sensorially engage with their sentient surroundings, or what Tim Ingold calls an education of attention. In the more than human convivial space of the grove, this multisensory immersion includes observing the movements of insects, birds, and mammals, noticing the growth of epiphytes along the boles of sago trunks, and watching the river ebb and flow around the matted roots of sago clusters. It also entails inhaling the damp soil underfoot, the petrichor rising after heavy downpours, and the sweet fragrance of damar gum and juniper twigs. For Marind, knowing sago in the grove means knowing the crunchy texture of the sago palm heart, the sweet aftertaste of sago water, and the milky flavor of sago grubs. It involves listening to the voices of the grove, the murmur of the wind, the trickle of the streams, the shy call of the black-crested bulbul, and the songs of fellow Marind companions as they rhythmically pound sago pith. Becoming anim or human in the grove is thus an embodied, sensory form of learning that requires cultivating what Anna Singh calls an art of attentiveness to one's sentient surroundings. By attuning to the life world of palms, people, and their diverse ecosystems, Marind develop personal relations to sago as both sustenance and as sibling. They become equipped with the knowledge and skills required to participate in and contribute to the activities, needs, and well-being of their human and more than human kin. Like flourishing sago palms, Children are helped along their journey of social and corporeal maturation by a range of agentive, non-human life forms who together shape the forest life world as a continuous and convivial field of more than human relations of both feeding and being fed. Large-scale deforestation and oil palm expansion in Merauke over the last decade have radically undermined the traditional food systems and environments of Indigenous Marind. These oil palm projects cover some 2 million hectares of former forest and savanna and are routinely designed and implemented without Indigenous landowners' consent and in the name of national food security. In 2012, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food warned that agro-industrial expansion in Merauke could adversely affect the food security of some 50,000 people. Indeed, many Marind today associate deforestation and monocrop expansion with the rise of a pervasive and inescapable sense of hunger. A hunger, as Evelina, a young woman from Mirab village, put it, that never goes away. On the one hand, this hunger is visceral. Deforestation, water contamination, and biodiversity loss have resulted in widespread protein and micronutrient deficiencies, local food insecurity, and infant malnutrition. According to data I obtained from the state clinic in Timasi Township in 2018, over 130 infants had died from malnutrition, dysentery, and food poisoning since 2013. As of 2016, around 20% of children under the age of 5 suffered from malnutrition and related conditions such as acute bacterial infections, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Up-to-date statistics remain difficult to obtain due to the remote location of many affected settlements and the absence of local doctors. At the same time, for many Marind, hunger is more than just the desire to eat triggered by the lack of food defined in generic terms. Rather, their experience of hunger as a condition provoked by the disappearance of nourishing forest foods has a significance that extends far beyond the quantitative measurements of calorific intake and nutritional value. This hunger was often described to me in terms of adverse transformations in people's bodily constitution. Women, for instance, spoke of their breasts becoming dry and their skin sallow from the absence of sago. Men talked about how the scarcity of forest game had depleted their bodies of wetness, meaning muscle. Children, infants, and babies were said to be particularly affected by hunger. Deprived of nourishing forest foods, their once glossy bodies turned skinny and grey. People also described how the experience of hunger and of witnessing the hunger of others gave rise to feelings of sadness, pity, and in particular, a pervasive sense of loneliness arising from their severed connections and convivialities with each other and with the forest and its diverse life forms. In other words, the obliteration of the forest and the expansion of monocrops ruptures the affective, material, and storied convivialities of humans to their other-than-human kin, whilst concomitantly depriving Marind of access to the nourishing foods that these other-than-human kin provide. For instance, many women mourned the decimation of sago groves where they had once celebrated their roles as mothers in the company of a plant whose fertile flesh and fluids, much like their own, had provided Marind children with nourishing sustenance. Other Marind lamented the decline in collective hunting and foraging activities that had once sustained the life-giving exchanges of wetness between humans and non-humans within the forest. Many villagers decried the fact that their children would never know the taste of forest foods, along with the myths and stories of the species they once would have hunted, fished, and foraged. Marind's plant and animal kin, too, are said to go hungry because of the arrival of oil palm. For instance, wild pigs and cassowaries find little to eat in the arid, homogeneous environment of the monocrop. Bamboo clusters and sago groves collapse as the soil is depleted of its minerals. Rather than water, nutrients, and symbiotes, species that once thrived in the company of humans now wilt and starve. Marind thus conceive of and experience hunger as a multi-species phenomenon that is distributed across humans, plants, and animals who once supported each other through nourishing exchanges of flesh and fluids. Instead, what they experience is a generalized, more than human gastroanomy, to borrow the term of sociologist Claude Fisher, in the sense of an axogenic breakdown of sociality provoked by the disintegration of traditional food systems and environments. Deforestation and oil palm expansion have also led to the substitution of forest foods with processed foodstuffs, rice, instant noodles, and biscuits, for instance. These processed foods, or city foods as Marind call them, are said by very many villagers to be bland, dry, and tasteless. Unlike forest foods, these city foods are nutritionally deficient in vitamins, proteins, minerals, and high in sugar, salt, and oil. More importantly, these foods are said to come from faraway places and are produced by people who are unknown to Marind. As Carolina, a young Marind woman from Halayam village, explained to me, these foods do not nourish the body, they do not taste of the land, they do not taste of the forest. Not only do city foods fail to satiate those who consume them, they are also said to exacerbate hunger. Children, for instance, clamor for more food within hours of eating instant noodles. Women describe snacking on processed biscuits throughout the day, but always craving more. Young men, meanwhile, talked of having become addicted to rice, which they would eat in copious amounts without ever feeling full. As Pius, a young man from Bayao village, described, when you eat from the forest, you can go without food for an entire day. But the more you eat city foods, the more you want to eat. This hunger never goes away. The divergent origins and effects attributed by Marind to forest foods and city foods point to the ontology of hunger as defined less by the absence of food in generic terms and rather by the loss of particular kinds of foods that are imbued with positive moral, social, cultural, and affective significance. The contrastingly negative attributes of city foods are further heightened by their association with the oppressive influence of Indonesia over West Papuan peoples, landscapes, and futures. Rice, for instance, is the staple starch of inhabitants of Java, the political and economic heart of Indonesia, where decisions about West Papua are often made without Papuans' consent. Rice is also associated with non-Papuan settlers, who exploit Marind lands and resources, monopolize formal employment, subject Marind to racial discrimination, and now represent the majority population in Merauke. Invasive and alien, city foods thus embody what Chamorro poet and scholar Craig Santos Perez calls gastrocolonialism, or imposed alimentary regimes that perpetuate the violence of colonization and imperialism through the medium of food. To conclude, indigenous food pedagogies and convivialities, including the ways in which Marind sense and make sense of food and hunger, make us reflect upon transforming foodways as morally imbued, affectively charged, culturally shaped, and sensorially loaded social facts, whose significance vastly transcends the reduction of food to nutrient groups and that of hunger to the lack of food defined in a generic sense. Rather, indigenous phenomenologies of food and hunger open a rich space for interdisciplinary nutritional research that is at once culturally sensitive, locally specific, and scientifically informed, or what one might call a subfield in ethnonutrition. Such approaches would attend to the sensory, emotional, and moral dimensions of hunger as lived experience. They would situate hunger within its geographically and historically divergent political, economic, and social contexts. They would examine how different foods and the persons, places, and practices these foods encompass give rise to different kinds of more than human convivialities and commensalities, including how humans themselves can become good food for others. Importantly, such approaches would take as their starting point the experiences and worldviews of those directly subjected to the deleterious effects of environmental degradation and consequent breakdowns in multi-species companionships, convivialities, and commensalities. Indigenous Marind Sago pedagogies reveal that food's nourishment derives just as much from food's material substance as from its origins, producers, and the human and ecological relations that food production depends upon and enables. Attending to such pedagogies of nourishing and reciprocal living with may in turn pave the way for the development of nutritional and dietary frameworks that can better account for the culturally shaped ways in which people understand food values, identities, and socialities, along with the diverse, more than human ecologies that feed, sustain, and grow them. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion. In the meantime, you can find out more about indigenous food convivialities and commensalities in a recent article published in Medical Anthropology titled Eaten and Being Eaten, The Meanings of Hunger Among Marind. For additional materials, please feel free to visit my website at www.morethanhumanworlds.com. Thank you.